I'm Mike Overhoff, a Pioneer rep from the Niagara region, and you're listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. My name's Andrew Campbell, a farmer myself who knows full well that testing and trialing all of these new products, all of these new methods, can be overwhelming. Whether it's a new variety on the market, or even just those accidental trials when the fertilizer runs out at the end of a field, it is critically important to be trying something new and then learning from those mistakes of the previous growing season. But how do you go about actually preparing a real trial or making the most of that mistake? As always, we're calling on the professionals to help us out. Dave Harwood and Holly Loucas are both part of the Pioneer team. Holly as an area agronomist for East Central Ontario, and Dave as technical services manager. Now, both Dave and Holly have managed and seen countless plots and trials over their careers and have been good enough to jump on the podcast to help us make the most of our own on-farm tests. The even more exciting part, we got to meet up in person. Well, Holly, Dave, thanks very much for being in person. We get to sit around a table and have a conversation. One of the whole points of this podcast, we're in the third season it's taken us, but we finally get to do this. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Same here.
So we want to talk about trials because I think one of the things that we've given a lot of information, I think, to growers over the last few seasons. And even for me as a grower, thinking there's so much out there, it's almost hard to keep up in what I should and shouldn't be doing. Trials is probably a really good solution for somebody like me, for a lot of growers, to figure out, is this actually going to work in my farm, in my conditions, all of that. So that's the conversation we're going to have today. Maybe we can start off with, from the beginning in your shoes, the more official trials, the more official plots that you both do. How do you go about doing that? Can I start with you, Dave?
Well, I think where it all begins is coming to a determination of what we're testing for. What geographic scope, what environmental scope are we testing for? So we had fancy talk for that would be, what is the target population of environments that we want to test our seed products in, for example? And that target population of environments, it's really the prevailing weather, prevailing soil types. What are we trying to, where are we trying to predict performance of whatever we're testing? And in my world, that's primarily plant genetics. So that's where it all starts, is what are we trying to predict and where? And so then once you come to that determination, you say, well, I need my trial system to reflect that large population of environments. So we're not going to test on every farm, but we want to test on farms that will provide us results that predict, to the best of our ability, performance across all farms. So that's where it really begins. And then once you've done that, you go about collecting a sample of environments, select farms that you'll actually do the testing on that you believe are reflective of that larger population of environments. Then within those farms, you are wanting to identify locations, fields, where you can do the trials that produce repeatable results, so that have uniform soil characteristics within the field. So the comparison between, in my case, variety A versus variety B are true and not a function of variation in the environmental conditions across that field. So I'd say that's a snapshot of where we begin the process.
Now then, when you start adding in beyond just the variety A versus variety B and start looking at fungicide or not, or this much nitrogen or that much, or whatever that is, what are some of the things from, again, that more kind of here's an official Pioneer plot, what are some of the things that you keep in mind when you're actually going through that process to make sure that the data is sound?
I guess the biggest thing to make sure that you're going to get some valuable data is to make sure the area of the field is big enough to represent, kind of that whole growing scenario, not just a tiny little snapshot of one tiny little part of the field. So make sure you do a big enough, either a block or whether you're doing, maybe 2 or 3 strips in the field that would cover off that whole area. And then also, I think is key, but sometimes gets forgotten, is to leave a check strip. So make sure there's a section of the field that didn't get, and a representative, not the headlands or anything, but a section of the field that doesn't get the treatment, or multiple if possible, so you can come back and do that comparison of product versus no product. And the other thing that comes to mind is, keep it simple. When you start testing 2 products at the same time, now you're introducing multiple variables. So in my opinion, it's kind of test one product at a time, then figure that one out. And if you needed to add a second one in a subsequent year, or whether that's 2 separate kind of product tests.
Well, because I think that's one of the questions that I always kind of wonder is how many trials or how many plots are too many? Now, it's going to depend on, obviously, the size of the grower, but like, is there a magic number? Like, is it just 1 or 2? Is it a bunch? Like, what should a grower be kind of thinking? What's a reasonable number?
Yeah, I think for me it's 2, meaning 2 levels of treatment that you're experimenting with for an on-farm trial. And what I mean by 2, meaning if you're testing, for example, a topical thing right now is corn fungicides in relation to an emerging pest in Ontario, tar spot. And so do you want to test a number of varieties? So that's level 1 with a fungicide, and level 2. I think if you get much more complicated than that, for example, combining fertility varieties and fungicide, to me that's getting too hard. So make your trial achievable and minimize the risk that the complexity is just going to confound the results and make it too difficult to execute.
So then if that variability is one of the, we'll call them maybe more common mistakes that some growers might do, what are some other kind of flags that a grower should think about that, they don't want to get too carried away, or mistakes that you see from growers in some of the trials that they're doing?
I think the one that sticks out most in my mind is, again, forgetting that check strip, right? To make sure you leave an untreated area of the field is definitely key, so you can do that comparison. An area that's too small sometimes is a problem as well. And then I think bigger than that is when you're selecting a field that you're going to look at. You either need to pick a field that doesn't have a lot of variability in it, so that you're kind of looking at similar environments across field and weather patterns, or if you have a variable field, is to make sure your strips go through all of the different levels of variability for all of your treatments. So to make sure, treatment 1 is going through 3 different variables, but then treatment 2 maybe only goes through 1. That's not really a fair comparison. So, and there's some tools that you can use. You look at imagery or some of the yield analysis software to where you can pinpoint areas of the field that are a certain way. You can select yield out of those and compare relative areas of the field that are similar. So there are some tools you can use to kind of get around some of those variability issues. But
I really like what you said about that, Holly, because we often, in my opening remark, I said, well, we want a uniform field. That was in the context of, testing hundreds of varieties in the same experiment, and we definitely need uniformity within that block when we're doing that kind of work. But with an on-farm trial, you really do want to sample that set of environments that your farm represents. And so you don't need a pristine, completely homogeneous field. And in fact, if your farm is like most and has variation in it, the key is just that your treatments experience that, all of them experience that variation. So in a simple example, varieties running up and down a field that might have strips of sandier ground running at right angles to the varieties, that's just fine as long as all the varieties experience some of those same that same variation, and in fact is more valuable because then you're evaluating the ability of those varieties to perform under the variation that exists on your farm.
So then going back to, okay, we're going to start a trial. We've decided what we're going to test. Maybe it's 2 different varieties. Maybe it's, fertility, whatever that is. We've picked our location, and I know around our place, I can assure you, I've got that clay on the front and the sand on the back, but it's the same from one end to the other, so we can find that variability within the field. Then it's in. Then what? How are we going to kind of manage those plots throughout the growing season, even before we go to actually take it off?
So, yeah, that's a very good point. Something you need to consider, and I would start with having kind of a plan that you're going to do throughout the growing season, some various points and things you want to look at, just to have it in your mind that you need to collect kind of these points. There's a lot of good tools. I like to start with satellite imagery, so you can put a field in there, you can do a plant health index on that field, and there's enough tools now that you can use to where you can pinpoint where that strip is in the field, and you can look at the health index from the air. And then once you have that image kind of in your head, or if you're carrying around on your iPad or your phone, you can actually go out to specific spots in the field in that treatment. Boots on the ground still gets you a lot of valuable information. I guess before boots on the ground, you can also use a drone to go around. A drone image is just lower. You're taking the picture from a lower altitude, so it's a lot more precise. So you can get some data from that. And then, like I said, if you can go in with boots on the ground and then verify kind of what you saw from the air, you still need that kind of looking at and touching and digging up some plant roots and kind of getting that on right in the ground experience to kind of figure out what's going on. But you can get some valuable info that way.
Because I'm guessing that, obviously, at the end of the day, yield is what we're trying to determine, good or bad. But there's probably a lot of signs through that growing season that we can identify that might, go beyond just what the yield number says.
Yeah, for sure. And in your question to Holly, you just asked, we've got the trial in, then what, or something to that effect. I think, then Holly responded with reference to a plan, and I think to me, that's the most fundamental concept when doing trialing, is have a plan. and especially a trial that involves a requirement to plant specifically for the trial, whether that's varieties or if you're testing populations or something. And because if you don't have a plan, we all get in that frenetic planting season and just go. And for me, the plan is best executed or best thought of is we're going to plant this trial in the middle of our planting activities, not the first field we plant, because stuff might not be set just right, all that stuff, and not the last, because if you leave your trials to the end, you may end up finishing planting in the first week of June. That's probably not reflective of your long-term farming operation. So just block some time in the middle, and with a plan. So you've got the area you're going to do it, the treatments, the varieties or the fungicides, what have you, and then a plan to collect information. And yeah, some yield is the ultimate measure. That's what we're after. But for some situations, stand measurements might be really what you're after. How uniform is my crop early on? Ultimately, yield is what we'll want to measure, but you want to understand whether the treatment is having an impact, how it's contributing to yield throughout the crop cycle.
I think just to follow up with what you just said is if you're not out in the field during that growing season and looking at the plants and assessing a stand, let's say on a sandy knoll, or whether it's a fungicide trial and maybe there's disease in one part of the field but not in the other, when you go back into harvest in the fall, some of those things aren't visible. So then you get yield data, but you don't really know where it came from, or if it's not as expected, you don't have any sort of idea as to why it's not there. So you've I feel like, wasted that opportunity to collect some information.
Now, I'm also thinking back to, years gone by where we've done trials and how poorly they go sometimes. One of the problems that we have run into in the past is always maybe you put a flag down or a stake that says, this is where that split is. It's a long time till November for that stake or that flag to remain in the field. But fortunately nowadays, there's more than that as technology. Where does technology fit, and what are some uses with a tool like Granular, for instance, to be able to use that to manage those trials?
So that's a really good point to bring out, is that there's a lot of technology that you can use to really make your life a lot simpler in the fall when you're going back. Even scrolling through a picture deck on your phone trying to find a picture from 3 months ago is difficult. So something like Granular, they have the capability now of dropping a pin. So like you said, when the flag, and I'm not sure why, but the flags always seem to attract a wheel at some point over the season and get run over and broken, or dragged down the field. So you can drop a pin, it's GPS referenced, it'll take you, those software will take you right back to that exact spot, so you know where your split is. And then there's also a note-taking option to where you can add a picture, you can make some comments, you can put several pictures on there. And the nice thing with that is if you did a trial in, let's say, soybeans this year, and then you've got corn and wheat in the rotation for the next 2, and you come back 3 years from now with soybeans again, you can still pull up that note from this year, and you could actually do almost like a secondary trial on that same area in that same growing environment. So there's lots of tools like that you can use.
Well, and I actually was a little entertained with, sitting in a Granular meeting a little while ago with John Saliga and our Pioneer rep Roland. The comment was, like, even there was that accidental trial strip, like that, was the 28 going on or not? Or did I run out? So let's do it again. And that simple process of, okay, let's put a pin here now so that at least we can kind of manage that. And then those maps actually did help find those trials out and where that was. So there does seem to be some advantages to using that kind of tech.
Yeah, I agree. On my own small farm, I ran out of starter with about 3 rounds to go, and I did exactly everything Holly was talking about. I used the Granular Insights app and dropped the pin, took a picture, did all of those things, and it was really useful because, as you say, you just lose track of that by the fall otherwise.
So just out of curiosity, given fertilizer prices, did you find you didn't need the starter, or did the trial show you maybe did?
Well, you know what? In this case, the starter didn't have the response I was expecting, and I use a liquid 2x2 starter, and but I'm undeterred.
Must have been a year. It was a year effect.
Just because I like the response I see in the crop with starter, it's got to be good. So there you go.
But it does go to how many of these trials can be even accidental ones, yes. And you might as well collect the data from it. Right. So then, in terms of going through that growing season and then getting to harvest. We talked about that rush of planting and that sometimes some of this stuff gets forgotten. I'm guessing when you go to collect some of that yield, some of this stuff can get forgotten as well. So what are some of the things in pulling that trial off that you did? What are some key things that you need to keep in mind to be able to make sure the data you collect is going to be valuable for you?
Yeah, my first response might not be the one you're expecting, but is that I think there's tremendous value in whatever information you do collect of combining it with a larger set of information. So somewhat different to maybe the target of your question, I would say I think there's great merit if you're, say, testing fungicides on tar spot in aligning or availing yourself of a network of trials that are going on that are very similar. And so working with a pioneer agronomist like Holly, who might have 10 growers doing very similar things, and she can bring you the information from the larger trial set. So that is kind of a different angle on your question. But I think it probably where you were more expecting the answer, I think it's really back to that plan and having making sure that as you plan the trial, you have the ability to collect the information, and they're in a robust way. And so I caution against yield monitor assessments of yield, for example, and would encourage folks, if you've taken the time to apply treatments in the field, to look to someone with a weigh wagon or using a scale to measure results. But that can be combined with yield monitor information or imagery to understand what variation might be behind those results that you collect.
Well, it actually did foreshadow my next question, which was, Holly, for you in working with growers in your area, what's your role and how can you support some of those trials? Because I'm assuming that you do see a lot of them. You probably know more exist than we even think. What can your role be? How can a Pioneer rep support? What's that relationship like?
So I think it starts with, like Dave was referring to, is getting that network of growers that are doing a similar trial, using similar products, or whether it's a hybrid. If you're looking at something like our PKP plots, which are our product knowledge plots, where we're testing a bunch of different hybrids, combining multiple locations of data and making kind of a recommendation for that area of how those different products perform. But then I also think as an agronomist, we can take that knowledge that we get from the larger plan and then narrowing it down, because I think there is some merit in testing things on your own operation with your own equipment and whatever fertility practices you have. You're not always going to be doing the same thing that the group was doing. So I think that's where there has to be a balance between looking at the bigger data set picture and then actually looking at it on your own farm and figuring out what works in your operation to kind of maximize your yields. Obviously, that's what you want to do, your ROI at the end. But so I think as an agronomist, we're the bridge between the big group of data, and then we can also be a good resource to give you ideas of what you can do on your own farm.
Now then, kind of thinking from, a single growing season of doing, a trial like this, as an example, the last episode we were talking to Dave Hooker and Greg Stopps about fertility, and one of the things he was talking about was even, thinking about the biological question, and does a product like Utrisha have any role? If I go in and I try a little bit this year and do that, is 1 year good enough that then I roll it out over the whole farm? Or, how does that plan that you talk about, Dave, how does that plan then evolve into, 2 to 5 to, longer term plans?
The usual agronomic response to questions like that is, well, it depends, but
weird. Dave Hooker told me that too.
I think, a principle we follow in the way we evaluate genetics is that by testing over a larger area, back to that balance between local and larger area data, is that multiple reps or replications of an experiment across the landscape provide a better prediction of future performance than any single trial result. And so my response would be that if you have a valid, if your trial says, boy, I validated the performance of this product on my farm, I like the way it looked, and then look at the larger data set and say, wow, and 80% of the trials in Southern Ontario, it also worked. That's a pretty good signal, in my estimation, that you've got a product that has some stability and that you've got a prediction there that product is likely to perform over a longer period of time. And that applies, varieties, that's certainly the case, but any input to the crop, I think, would fall in the same category.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I think if something looks like it's showing merit on your farm, I'm still not sure I would buy in 100% just off of even the 1 year data and even the multiple data set. But I like to look at about 3 years of data on farm before I would, 100% roll it out across the acres. And maybe it's a matter of, performed on this soil, fields with this soil type. So, you're kind of refining your farming operation but over multiple years.
So then, just so I make sure I'm clear on this, I'm going to plan out my trials, and I'm really going to plan because, you know, I want to know what I'm collecting from it. I want to know if, you know, what I've got to do through the growing season. I'm not going to get too complicated. I'm only going to pick, you know, 1 or 2 things, you know, at most to do that. I'm definitely going to have a check strip to be able to do that. And then I'm going to monitor through the year and then make sure that, you know, at the end of the year, I'm not going to just trust the yield monitor. I'm also going to run it over scale or get a weigh wagon or something like that. Have I missed anything? Am I a, you know, test plot expert now?
I think you've really hit the highlights of sort of the fundamental principles of effective on-farm research. Is really what it is. You're doing your own research.
So I would add one thing is that you need to write this down somewhere, right? You need to record your results somewhere so that you can easily go back over years past, whether it's electronic or I feel like the electronic's probably a better method than, and there's a lot of tools that are better than maybe paper, but at least recording it somewhere what you did and what the results were, because by next spring, sometimes it either gets inflated or the other way.
Or that stake gets run over in the field. So I better mark it with a pin. Well, Holly, Dave, thanks very much for doing this today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, always fun talking about this kind of a subject. Thank you.
Next time, we're going to take a step further and go field side to talk about Enlist. After all, 40% of America's bean acres are now traded Enlist. Is that what's coming to Canada? We'll find out next time on the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. On behalf of myself and the entire team working behind the scenes on this, thanks so much for listening. Don't forget, you can always get in touch on Twitter at the handle Pioneer Seeds CA or my personal handle, Fresh Air Farmer. And for more info or advice, talk to your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.